in their bilateral relations and border disputes, and figuring out based on, and China contributed, at that time, suggested these 5 principles as a means to have a conversation and to be able to engage one another from a perspective of mutual respect, right? So I think it's all right. I think no developing country, no global south country should shy away too much from feeling a sense of pride in their contributions to a more equal, a more inclusive international order, which was very rightly, resonated with the Bandung movement as well. The Bandung movement was a sentiment, and these 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that pre-existed. Today, even Indian commentators will say that they were introduced by China, and even Indians take pride in that concept today. So there's nothing wrong with admitting that they started with China, but at the same time, it's important to say that they deeply resonate, and they also resonate with historic civilizational values of various parts of the world, whether we talk about maybe the African civilization, or maybe an East Asian or pagan civilization. So we can all recognize, even if one country, one nation initiated, it doesn't mean that they're trying to, dominate in any way. The ownership factor remains because these principles stand relevant today. Coming to your second question, but that was my perspective. Coming to your next question, I think China has historically not been a colonial power. China hasn't had a history of colonizing other countries. China is also an economic power. And we also increasingly see that, when, for example, even an initiative as big as the Belt and Road Initiative, it has been evolved into an initiative that also includes the SDGs and the International Charter and the ambition, to strengthen the legal international order so that all countries, regardless of how big or treated more equally, is something that promoted for decades. Since, we see 45 plus years since the reform and opening up in China is becoming an important economic power. So there is no evidence, and I think one of the big reasons is that China is essentially a pragmatic power. China is also a continental power. China is affected by conflict. China is impacted by, wars in West Asia, God forbid in East Asia. The peace in the world is something that positively also impacts China's own domestic goals. And this is something which can also explain that, China, there's so far no evidence to suggest that China would shift away from these principles and would rather be more like a hegemonic power that sees itself above the international legal order. And I think a second reason is also that we haven't seen the United States benefiting from its hegemonic position. It's not a respected country in the world. It's not a country that is trusted in the world. So being a dominating power that considers itself above the international law has not served the United States well. And I will also use the word maritime used by Professor Ian. It's important that to recognize that China has a long-term perspective. Thousands of years of history, and to recognize that maybe short-term gains can be achieved by reducing the importance of international law and by assuming a might is right policy. But in the long term, the mutual gains are more important. Mutual respect is more important. So far we see that historically, and given China's current influence in the world, increasing stakes in the world, peace and a legal order, an international legal order that is strong, is beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, long-term perspective is really important. Even if when we talk about, say, major power competition and rivalry, how many years can they go on? Maybe decades or a century? But they cannot go forward and go on forever. So, Professor Shigimaki, China says the 5 principles are part of the cornerstone of Beijing's foreign policy. For example, China has successfully solved border issues on land with 12 out of the country's 14 neighbors, as well as the maritime disputes in the Beibu Bay area with Vietnam. So what do you make of the role of the 5 principles in the settlement of those territorial issues?
I think certainly the patience and the idea of mutual non-aggression is very important when there are disputes. All in all, I think also the rejection of interference, rejection of respect for sovereignty, etc., has been very good for the prevention of escalation of already existing disputes and conflicts. So in that sense, they are relevant also in the disputed territories. At the same time, I think the long peace of East Asia is mainly based on the strong respect for sovereignty of the countries in East Asia. And if you are in a territory where which is disputed, this is difficult. I mean, how can a country respect other countries' sovereignty in an area where it claims sovereignty for itself? So this is why, despite the great success of the long peace of East Asia, there's a weak spot in areas where sovereignty cannot be respected because of disputes about whose sovereignty counts in that disputed area. So I think this is one thing where especially the mutual non-aggression and this patience, patient negotiation and continuous negotiation, even if it takes long time, is quite important.
So, Professor Guan, what is your take about this question? I mean, there are still some of the unresolved territorial issue between China and certain nearby countries, and between some of these regional countries in Asia as well. For those issues, for those disputes, do you think the 5 principles are still relevant today?
I mean, it's absolutely relevant, and particularly, I think the non-interventional principle plays a very vital role here. Usually, the general or the Western central hegemonic perspective in resolving this kind of territorial conflict will be through a top-down approach. Either there will be a hegemon, a superpower, gives order to everyone, and then resolve the problem as the main sort of mediator. Another principle is that two equal partners treat each other equally and resolve the conflict through mitigation and negotiation. And in fact, for a long time, this has always been the protocol that the Afro-Asian world has respected. And we can trace this back to a very, very long historical durée. And you can see cases where disputed space, where the ownership is not necessarily key, but joint ownership and the right to pass, the right to share are at the center of the discussion. So you can see nowadays the same principle was used by China and observed quite closely. China always emphasized that the non-interventionist principle in resolving these Asian-related territorial disputes, and this particularly addressing to the international hegemon, which tends to resolve the dispute through a military or political interventionist way, whereas within Asia or within the disputed areas, China emphasized the importance of negotiation, sharing space, and
your point's well taken, but we have to cut you here because we need to take a short break. But coming back, our discussion will continue.
Hi, I'm Dan Wang, Chief Economist of Hang Seng Bank, China. The World Today is a real fun program. You will hear interesting people discussing global trend, economic events, what's happening in and outside of China. So, friends around the world, hope you can join us.
Welcome. I'm Elaf Bellard, economics professor and member of the Data Science and AI Center at New York University, Shanghai. On the World Today program, you can find in-depth and impartial insights, as well as critical commentary on key trends in the Chinese economy, financial technology, business, and blockchain. To prepare for the world tomorrow, join me on World Today. Welcome back. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Han in Beijing. Today we're talking about 70 years on, why the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence put forward by China back in the year 1954 still matter in the world today. Joining our panel discussion, Dr. Yingzhi Guan, Professor of International Politics with Fudan University, Zoom Emily Khan, Research Fellow with the Center for China and Globalization, and Dr. Timo Kivimaki, Professor of International Relations with the University of Bath in the UK. So, going back to our discussion, so Professor Ying, before the break, you were elaborating regarding why China advocates non-interventionism in terms of resolving the regional territorial disputes between some particular countries. Could you finish your point first?
Well, I mean, I'm pretty much there because basically, I think the point is interventionism creates a problem. It's actually external interventionism that comes from a hegemon will create a problem that leads to further complications. Whereas non-intervention principles has long been considered as the traditional way of resolving issues by respecting the engaging partners equally.
Okay. So, Zoom, actually, when we talk about this idea regarding mutual non-intervention in each other's internal affairs, that's really a key spirit among the 5 principles, and this non-interventionism is emphasized in China's foreign policy, including when China provides loans and aid to other countries with no strings attached. Coming from Pakistan, you are very familiar with this principle, I guess, especially, for example, when China is involved in the construction of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, known as CPEC in short. But on the other hand, this non-interventionism has long been criticized by some people as so-called accommodating bad governance. How would you respond to those ideas?
Wow, it is complicated, it's a challenge, I think, for China as well at times, when, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative was initially announced. And for me personally, I'll also say that as a Pakistani, we were also very familiar with the war in Afghanistan and the moralism around it, and the inability at that time of the Western interventionist powers to accept political solutions, which were the region's demand. So the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and accepting that, you don't get to tell a developing country exactly how to govern. Don't dictate the domestic matters was very important. And it was important to us when CPEC was announced. So I think one of the issues that with time, the Belt and Road Initiative in its initial years did face was that at times, the amount of investment committed by Beijing under BRI projects became a symbol for many elected governments in countries like Pakistan, but also many other countries, as a measure of how successful they are in their cooperation with China. But really, it's about how successfully governments can absorb and utilize that investment. So we can find, and we have with time, found a middle ground where it's not political strings attached. This is completely against Beijing's mindset. But at the same time, there are mechanisms between China and countries like Pakistan or the African continent in the name of FOCAC. You have the China Central Asia Forum as well, where the exact mechanics of how different investment commitments can be utilized by the host countries is being discussed, where good governance through mutual cooperation, for example, through the NDRC of China and the Planning and Development Commission of Pakistan, is being discussed to enable Pakistan and other Belt and Road countries to be able to absorb the investment well. So I would say, critics, there are many critics because we are in what we say, whether we talk about scholarship, decades of, analyzing how global affairs work and how powerful countries engage with one another. It has been assumed that somehow political strings attached should have a sense of moralism while engaging with a country that is somehow inferior, economically less developed, has become accepted, but it is also at the same time rejected and disliked by developing countries. It is something that China and the Global South collectively reject. But at the same time, better approaches can be adapted to ensure that the investment in a very pragmatic way can be guided towards better governance and better utilization through mutual coordination. So I think with time we are expanding. The BRI is also expanding in terms of sophistication of these dialogues, these conversations, and the mechanisms. And also, for example, in President Xi's speech, he also mentions the agriculture cooperation and trilateral cooperation between countries on these very targeted challenges that developing countries face. So that's a way to be pragmatic, not moralistic, but pragmatic and effective in terms of outcomes.
Yeah, I sometimes even have this kind of feeling that it's really not to the point to judge whether the local governance is good or bad. I mean, people are not necessarily morally bad. It's simply because of a lack of expertise and relevant knowledge, and that's why I guess China has been very active in terms of passing on its own technology, its own know-how to some of the less developed countries elsewhere in Asia, in Africa, etc., etc. Now, Professor Ing, some people say China's international advocates of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence actually gained additional momentum following the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya. What is your observation?
Okay. Well, I think this question is correlated to the previous question, and allow me to say a bit more on the previous question. I think that if we turn the table around, right, let's look at interventionism. Interventionism historically has never created anything good, right? Historically speaking, the biggest interventionism is colonialism. It's coming over with the idea that I know the best for your peoples, for handfuls. I know how to utilize your land. I know how to cultivate things, and I will tell you what to do, and I know the best for you. And they call them enlightenment or civilizing mission. They call it development or whatever you name it. And nowadays, interventionism has been put on with the moral aspect, meaning that this is a moral liberal obligation to interfere, to spread the idea of liberalism. I think if we step back a little bit, no difference from colonialist rhetoric. However, this kind of interventionism, this type of hegemonic, imperialist, colonial expansion has generated momentum for the rest of the world, either in the format of resistance, or in the format of cooperation. Both of them, cooperation among the global south or the colonized world, have one fundamental aspiration. They're not rejecting the ideal of transformation. They're not rejecting the idea of development and modernization, but they reject the ideal of being pulled and subjugated to a hierarchical order. So henceforth, I think, yes, in a way, NATO intervention in Libya creates some sort of momentum for the global south, for the no-interventionist ideal, but this has, in a long historical durée, this is not new. The aspiration for equal treatment, the aspiration to empower ourselves, to find our own subjectivity, it has always been there. It has been but in a long historical durée, the momentum is always there. The type of modernization we're aspiring to is what I call the empowerment modernization. We want to be our own and we want to be treated as an equal partner and contribute to the human history, quoting the General History of Africa's opening sentence, which is very touching. Africa has its own history, but we are part of the human history and want to contribute to the human history. Same thing has been said by, for example, China early at the early stages of People's Republic of China, like Chairman Mao, Zhou Enlai. They always say that China is part of the human world, and we want to make contribution to the entirety of the human world.
Okay, so Professor Timo Kivimaki, going to you. Would you agree with this point that intervening in other countries' internal affairs is in essence rooted in a sense of colonial or imperial mindset?
I agree with what has been said here. I think it is an imperial and colonial mindset. Just as colonialism was justified in beautiful words and humanitarian interventionism has also been justified that way. I think the main reason why I feel it shouldn't be done, and why it's wrong, is that humanitarian all the unilateral interventions like the one in Libya, they have failed. And that they shouldn't be done because of the fact that they increase the number of fatalities. Even so that when I once worked with conflict statistics, I realized that during the first year of intervention, these interventions are often justified as protecting people. They are often justified by the responsibility to protect. Now, do they protect if during the first year the number of fatalities of organized violence increases by 720%. This is my calculation during the first year. Now, if we then look at how often unilateral interventions fail, in two of the three cases, 2/3 of the cases, they fail in a way that, I'm looking at all the 16 cases that there has been where big powers have kind of used the argument of humanitarian intervention in the post-Cold War era. In 12 of those 16 cases, they have increased the number of fatalities during and after the operation compared to how it was before so-called protection. And I think this is especially problematic because of the fact that there is an alternative to unilateral interventionism. The United Nations does fantastic work in its peacekeeping. When I said that 12 out of 16 post-Cold War operations have failed in a sense that they have increased fatalities during and after the operation. This has happened also in 4 of UN's 36 post-Cold War operations. Only 4. And in 3 of the 4, in Mali, Syria, and Central African Republic, during the time of UN peacekeeping, there was also a unilateral peacekeeping. So basically, out of the 36 operations, UN has failed only in Rwanda, whereas more than two-thirds of the cases of unilateral intervention, like Libya, fail and increase fatalities during and after the operation. So that's why I think it may be colonial, it may be imperial, but it's always failing, and that's why it shouldn't be done.
It's always been failing, and even, I guess, some diplomats based in Washington, D.C., they are having a sense of self-reflection about the mistakes in the past regarding reckless intervention. I guess I remember I once heard the existing U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken elaborate in his foreign policy that going forward, Washington will stop pursuing regime change, but of course in many of the other fields, intervention on the part of Washington is continuing, for example, in the form of imposing economic sanctions against more than 24 countries across the world today. But that's another issue. So, Professor Ying, when we talk about the war in Ukraine, for example, the outcome appears to be that some countries want to seek their own security at the cost, at the expense of other countries' security. And China's position on the Ukraine crisis is really about calling for common, sustainable security. In other words, every country's security and national interests should be taken into consideration, should be ensured, and every country's sovereignty should be respected. And these are really the key ideas in President Xi Jinping's global security initiative. So, to what extent do you think these ideas represent further development of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence?
I mean, absolutely, I completely agree. I think to put it simply, the further development of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence resides, and it has always been, only in the United Nations. And the United Nations and other parts of other formats of multinational international organizations create a platform for negotiation as well as observe the principle of peaceful coexistence and other really mutual respect and the non-intervention principle. I think there is a possibility for us to create great international order that we could see the potential of development without necessarily the risk of war. So yes, it is, and we can see that in China's continuation of support the fundamental principle of the United Nations, and China has always emphasized that there is only one international rule, one international rule-based order. It is United Nations protected and honored and sanctioned by the United Nations, and not necessarily from only one country, but a joint initiative coming from everybody.
So, Zoom, what is your understanding of President Xi Jinping's signature notion of community of shared future for mankind? President Xi Jinping said in his Friday address that this particular notion represents the best inheritance and enrichment of the 5 principles based on the situation today. What is your take?
I think the one thing that one of our, Professor Timo, for example, some minutes back mentioned how East Asia, for example, has prospered, right? Because the region had made a consensus to promote pragmatic development. Regions prosper and flourish together. At the same time, you go west of China, the 40 years of war in Afghanistan have impacted the entire region, the entire neighboring region negatively. And it might take us decades to really overcome the consequences of that. So the recognition that, we as regions or as a global community, we share the same space, we prosper and perish together is something that is quite central, in my view, to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and also to when we talk about a community with a shared future. So community with a shared future is to recognize that dividing countries, pursuing bloc politics, calling some your allies and others your foes, and then pursuing moralistic ambitions, thinking that power can, be your license to act with impunity and to treat others unfairly. All of that is only going to have the consequence of blowback. And we see that blowback. We have seen it countless times. We see in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the so-called invisible wars that were pursued by the United States, like was also mentioned by some of our speakers earlier, that previously we thought that colonialism was accepted, and then suddenly it was not. And imperialism is also becoming increasingly an obsolete concept that is being rejected. And the alternative to that is to recognize that we are one global community. We will prosper and flourish together. Look at climate change. the fact that even if some countries and some parts of the world are pushing for, more trade restrictions and barriers, the fact is that we are in a more globalized world. The fact is that perspectives from the global south are very relevant today as well. What is being discussed and what's being said is of relevance. And even when you mentioned Antony Blinken's statement, I don't think that recognition of intervention being bad would have ever been made if the voice of the global south has not been this loud and not been this united on this issue. So everybody, those countries, invisible wars were not invisible for Laos, the suffering of the people of Iraq, Afghanistan, other countries in the world was their real suffering, but now those voices have become louder. So to see that the alternative is a reality where we recognize that perishing or dividing is going to make us all worse off, is going to make us collectively worse off. In the short term, it's not, then in the long term. This is something that is so fun. And I think one of the reasons we do recognize that some of the policies coming out of the United States, the EU, or what we call the Five Eyes, their goal cannot be to actually limit China's growth, because that is impossible. They cannot replace China, but it is just for the time being, for as long as possible, to have some kind of competitive edge or some kind of, because it's against their ego even to say that we can learn from China, which is unfortunate. And I think that societies would think differently and increasingly think differently when they see that parts of Asia and the previously developing regions have come so far and have a lot to contribute to the world. So whichever part of the world you're from, you have something to contribute to a world, and the shared goals need to be above short-term gains which are divisive.
Okay. So, Professor Kivimaki, on one hand, we have this notion, community of shared future for mankind, that we're all belonging to one community, one global community. But on the other hand, frankly speaking, this mindset, us versus them, continues to be there. Notably, this idea regarding democracy versus autocracy, etc., etc. So at the end of the day, Professor, which notion, which kind of thoughts do you think will end up winning the hearts of the people?
First of all, I like this idea of community of shared future. It is also interesting because it's not many weeks since actually Pope Francis said almost exactly the same thing, that we are either successful together or then we are going to be doomed together. So all in all, I think it's something that appeals to all kinds of people. Now, to some extent, I do understand both rationales, the community of shared future and also the democracy versus autocracy. Not really democracy versus autocracy, but the democracy thinking. I understand it in this sense that if we have a country and we are not sure if its leadership genuinely represents the people of that country, if this is not the case, then it's difficult to work for the mutual benefit of our countries because we don't know if what the leaders want is what people want as well. So there is a certain rationale there, but at the same time, I think the problem really is that first of all, that most people refuse to be led by leaders of a foreign country. So that's why I think international relations cannot ever be built on principles based on intrastate political systems. We do have studies showing how good guys and bad guys framing clearly increases violence, not only in international relations but basically all relationships. So in that sense, I understand the idea that to avoid war and to build an international system in which each country has can peacefully build their own happiness, we should focus on relationships. So we should focus on the shared future rather than framing things as good guys, bad guys. I think actually this is something that we should be. Us academics and us scholars should also pay attention to different dreams that different countries, different principles that different countries have. We in the West, we should be studying carefully the five principles. We should be studying carefully the Chinese dream documents and other documents. Whereas in China, it would be useful to study the different dreams of other countries. And I think there should be, this is actually something I've been thinking of, there should be a big research program that studies the visions of different countries and tries to see how these principles can be reconciled. If such a program existed, I would be happy. I would be eager to participate or lead it. Simply because of the fact that I think this is exactly what we would need. That we look at principles that different countries bring, and then we try to understand each other's and try to see how they can be reconciled. I think that would bring something to our shared and shared future, I think.
Your point's highly appreciated. So, Professor Ying Zhiguang, we still have about 90 seconds before we need to wrap up our discussion today. So, briefly, the final question before we let you go. I mean, zooming from the 1950s to the current era, over the past 7 decades, different generations of Chinese leaders may have
conference. That's it, Andrew.
Международное радио Китая, серийная программа «Нихао, Тунго, здравствуй, Китай».
Слово на сегодня. Полностью. Вызови оборот.
Слава, скажи, какое китайское блюдо тебе нравится больше всего?
Я люблю очень много. Например, тофу.
Number 5.